The US has warned Russia that using nuclear weapons in Ukraine would have catastrophic consequences. That's after Russia's foreign minister pledged that regions annexed in separatist areas of Ukraine would have Moscow's full protection. The votes are being held in 4 Ukrainian regions occupied by Russian forces. Kyiv and its Western allies say the referendums are a sham and will never be recognized. Right, let's take you to the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, now, and join AP correspondent John Gambrell. Good to see you, John. Let's start with reports of a very sophisticated air defense system given to Ukraine by the Americans. Tell us about this new system and the difference it's likely to make.
Ukraine over the last couple of days has really faced an evolving threat from the Russians. As you mentioned earlier in your broadcast, the strike in Odessa overnight saw basically what we believe to be Iranian-made so-called suicide drones smash into an ammunition depot there and spark a massive explosion. And we've seen in Odessa and a couple other places over the last few days a series of these attacks. And Ukraine has been asking the West for more air defense systems. So in the last few days, we've had the Ukrainians say that the Americans are providing these so-called NASAM systems. These are systems that can be on the back of trucks or even in mobile launchers. And basically, they provide a level of security that can fire a missile up into the air and strike aircraft, helicopters, other missiles, and drones. This is incredibly crucial as the Ukrainians want to try to control the airspace they have over Ukraine. They've had some success so far with shooting down Russian helicopters and jets in the conflict, but they need more sophisticated arms to be able to shoot down these drones. And this NASAMS may provide the answer. However, I have to caution that any sort of air defense system has a real hard time trying to target these drones, in part because they're so small, they fly pretty slowly, and when they come in for the final attack, they just come straight down, swooping directly down at the ground, making it really difficult for any air defense system to hit them. So while the NASAMS is going to represent sort of a game changer to give the Ukrainians a little bit more of an edge to protect the airspace, I'm sure Kyiv is going to ask for more systems to come.
And what's the latest, John, on the mass mobilization of troops in Russia to fight in Ukraine? I understand it's heightened nerves. Many people have been escaping Russia, and at least one army recruitment officer has been shot.
It's pretty dramatic. There's really signs of dissent that are starting to bubble up in Russia. From Moscow, where police have arrested protesters as part of a campaign that has seen some 2,000 demonstrators arrested since this mass mobilization was declared, to even areas in the rural parts of Russia. You mentioned Dagestan earlier. That's a predominantly Muslim area, closer sort of to the Caspian Sea. And there, people have been seen in videos scuffling with police, women actually pushing police, shouting at them, saying this is not a war that their men had signed up for. This was not an invasion that their men backed. And we're also seeing flights filled with military-aged men taking off, going to places like Dubai and anywhere else that's still taking Russian air traffic. And we're seeing trains full and these massive lines at land borders that are still allowing Russians, that are still remaining open rather, for Russians to come across. All part of a sign that people are trying to get out, that people are starting to get a little concerned that this so-called special operation that President Putin had described is actually turning into the one war that he hasn't wanted to say so far, which is a war.
Nevertheless, John, in spite of all those series of attacks that you talked about on recruitment offices in Russia, the mass mobilization continues, doesn't it?
Absolutely, Charles. In the last day, we've had the British military come out and say they believe that some of these Russian soldiers who have been called up are already starting to report to military bases. That's based on an intelligence report they put out this morning. But they're also cautioning that even if the Russians get these forces to the front line, they're going to face a lot of challenges. First of all, it's not clear how much training these soldiers are going to get before they go out. There's a wide gap in age from anywhere from 18 to, I believe, up into the 60 years old. And, again, this descent is really troublesome. With Putin trying so hard to present a unified Russia at this point, these arrests, this shooting you mentioned earlier at one recruitment center in Siberia that saw that senior military officer shot, it's really affecting the morale of Russia, or Russia that had been believed, from the beginning when this war started in February, that President Putin was right, that it would just be a matter of days. And as we both know, the Ukrainians were able to blunt that initial offensive that tried to take Kyiv, where I am right now. They've been able to retake territory in the northeast right now, wide swaths of territory that have changed sort of the game board. And that's sort of what's pushed the Russians into both this mass mobilization, a mobilization that we haven't seen Russia take part in since World War II, as well as their efforts to try to annex this new territory, to make it part of Russia, to make it in Moscow's mind, more dangerous for the Ukrainians and the Westerners who back them to attack.
Well, absolutely. Meanwhile, John, it's coming up to the last day of voting in that Russian-sponsored referendum in occupied Ukraine. What's your assessment of how it's gone?
So far, there's been two different versions of this that we've seen. Russian state television has shown Russian flag-waving Ukrainians lining up, some standing in the rain to vote. But in surveillance camera footage at apartment blocks and with what Ukrainian officials have said, they offer a totally different perspective. They say armed Russian troops have been going door to door in apartment buildings, basically, in their words, intimidating voters to vote. Some Ukrainian officials say that those who vote no on the annexation have their names written down in a ledger, alleging that it's a part of a sort of a pressure campaign on the Ukrainians to make them vote yes, even though the international community and the Ukrainians say that it's going to be a rerun of what we saw in 2014 when the Russians seized Crimea and then held an internationally criticized vote to annex it. So as of this point, it's really unclear what's going to happen. Tomorrow is the last day of voting, though, and they're going to actually open polling stations in some of these occupied territories for Ukrainians to vote. So it'll be interesting to see, one, if there's actually a turnout there. But again, the Ukrainians and the West say this vote is likely to be just another sham.
John, thanks very much indeed. And I do have to say that we immensely appreciate all your reporting there from Ukraine. John Gambrell is the AP correspondent, and he was talking to me from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv.